I'd like to turn the floor over to my good colleague, friend, and co-founder of the Kellogg Innovation Network, Mr. Peter Bryant.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Kin Global 2015. And what a great theme, growth for good. I can't think of any better way of kicking this off than introducing our two speakers, Rich Karlgaard, the publisher of Forbes, and Todd Tillemans, President of Customer Development from Unilever. So a few opening remarks while they come and sit on the sofa. Welcome, guys. So we don't have any engagements to announce, honeymoons to announce, beautiful jewelry from Afghanistan, but we do have the coolest shoes of anybody. So Rob and I both were like, black leather shoes, those, much better. So what we're going to talk about today is Rich is not only the publisher of Forbes, but of a great book called The Soft Edge, Great Companies Looking for Lasting Success. Within that book, he explores what I think are the necessary ingredients that a company needs to acquire to ensure that it achieves growth for good and achieves significance in the world. Todd, representing Unilever, really brings, I think, a company that I admire greatly, that is really aspiring to achieve much of what's in Rich's book. But, you know, it's all about Paul Palmer, their CEO, set them on a transformational journey a few years ago when he set out the challenge that as a company, we need to serve society first. And by serving society first, that will drive growth in the company and ultimately shareholder value, and in that order. And Unilever continues on that journey and faces many, many challenges in achieving that. And I think is a great pioneer and example to organizations globally in what needs to be achieved. As Rob said, you know, this is one of the great challenges I think we all face as organizations to how to achieve this. And it's being demanded of us, I think, by consumers and customers. It's a very complex topic. It's got multiple layers. So in the next 45 minutes, we could talk about this for hours, obviously. But in the next 45 minutes, what we want to do is inject into this room some thinking, some thoughts, and some provocations that will inspire you in your conversations over the next 3 days and beyond in terms of how you can take your organizations and embody many of the principles and capabilities that we're going to talk about, not only on this panel, but throughout the 3 days of Kin Global. So what I'd like to do is, with no further ado, is welcome Rich to kick us off. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for that great introduction, Rob. I do believe that good will be the killer app in business going forward. And I must preface everything I'm saying by it's really humbling to speak when a giant like Philip Kotler is in the audience. Much of what you will hear is derivative of Philip Kotler and Peter Drucker and some of the giants whose shoulders I've attempted to stand on. I've lived my whole adult life in Silicon Valley, where there has just been great innovation one after another. But of late, I've begun to think that culture is going to be the killer app going forward. The culture will be the differentiator in a world of abundance. Abundance is something that Silicon Valley has created. Moore's law creates abundance, not just in semiconductors and not just in bandwidth and not just in computer power, but you think about the fracking revolution. It would have been impossible without bringing all of this great computer power, satellite imagery, and so on to bear. And so everywhere you look in the world today, you see abundance. You see talent is global, innovation is becoming cheap, every market is getting crowded. And so in such a world of abundance, what stands out? And my conclusion is that culture will become of greater and greater value going forward in a world of abundance. The other thing about culture is that it is the secret to long-term vitality. I used to call my column in Forbes Digital Rules, and I began to change the name of it in around 2009, looking at the aftermath of the recession, looking at the kinds of companies that were coming out of the recession, careers that were coming out of the recession, and wondering why wasn't everybody having this snapback in the recovery of the recession. What was different about this recession is that it seemed to be taking down business models and careers down for the count. And so I became very interested in looking at what it was that gave companies this kind of long-term vitality and see if we could parse out the reasons why. My hypothesis was that vitality requires health. If it's true in human beings, why wouldn't it be true in companies and careers as well? And when you Google around using the word health, one of the things you'll come across fairly quickly is the United Nations Triangle of Health for Human Beings. Now, this is a very simple diagnostic device. What you see is what you get. The whole thing is right here. So if you belong to an organization like Doctors Without Borders, and you're going into some impoverished part of the world, and your task is to see 1,000 people in a week, all you can really do is triage, right? There's no way that you can get everybody an adequate diagnosis with that kind of time pressure. So you whip out your triangle of health, and you try to assess within 5-10 minutes every person standing along the three sides of these triangle. Number one, are they physically healthy? Now, physically healthy in the affluent West means, have you completed a triathlon in the last 12 months? That's not what it means in the impoverished parts of the world. It means, do you have enough nourishment, and are you free of disease? Mental and emotional health. Here in the affluent West, it means that we are well up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as Rob pointed out. What this really means is, can people think rationally? Can they see the consequences of their action? And social means, let's say you have physical health, and let's say you have mental and emotional health. Are you going home to a violent village or a violent home? And the whole idea with this triangle is, if you're going to be healthy today and predictively healthy tomorrow, you have to be strong on all three sides. If you take any one of those sides away, you jeopardize somebody's long-term health prospects. Well, 2 years ago, I'm sitting in the office of one of my favorite entrepreneurs of all time, Fred Smith, who started FedEx in 1971. You might recall he got a B or a C in his Yale School of Management paper on overnight delivery, and he got the last laugh on that. 50 billion in size, 300,000 employees around the world. And I asked Fred what accounts for FedEx's success over the years. He gets up to his whiteboard in his office in Memphis, Tennessee, and he draws a triangle. It's the same triangle as the UN Triangle of Health, and he uses almost the identical words. He said, we have to be really good at three things all at the same time. We have to have a great strategy, we have to have great execution, which I called the hard edge for reasons I'll explain, and we have to have great cultural values. He said, if you take away any one of those, you jeopardize the long-term health prospects of FedEx. Well, I asked him for a little more explanation. This is what he said about strategy. He said, market, customers, competitors, that's kind of strategy 101. If you can fog a mirror and you're in business, you darn well better know who your market, what your market is and who your customers and competitors are. A graduate level strategy is when you get into the area of substitutes and disruptors. Substitutes simply means somebody comes into your competitive space, you've never seen them before, you've never heard of them, you can't quite identify them, except that you know that your customers are kind of leaking out to them, and you got to figure out why. And the big strategic question is, what do you make of these substitutes? Are they allies? Are they competitors? Do you try to acquire them? Do you try to put them out of business? And then some subset of those substitutes will become disruptors, which simply means they're on a very, very, very fast evolutionary path, faster, in fact, than the one that you're on, and they will come up your tailpipe very fast if you don't know what's going on. So the first three are pretty easy. The last two, I think, are what gets you into the C-suite of companies, the big leagues of strategy. Have to be good at that stuff. The second side you have to be good at is the side of execution. I called it in my book the hard edge because every one of these things named here are things that you can measure with precision. It's not that they're harder to do. The very fact that you can measure them in many ways makes them easier to do than the stuff on the cultural value side. You can measure speed. You can measure cost. You can measure how you're doing in supply chain and logistics. We're well into the era of the big data revolution. You can measure that. We're seeing things that we couldn't see before with new measurement tools. And you can measure your capital efficiency. This is where, by the way, CFOs live, COOs live, the head of the supply chain lives here, your treasurer lives here. These are the people who wrestle with numbers all the time. The people who live on the strategy side are the CEOs and the board of directors. What the hard edge is all about is relentless improvement, or what a sports team in the world of cycling calls continual marginal gains. You're constantly seeking 2% improvement here, 5% over improvement over there, doing it relentlessly, adding it up using numbers, keeping yourself honest. Third side of the triangle now gets a little trickier. This is the side of cultural values. I called it the soft edge simply because it's harder to measure performance here. You can really only see how you're doing in the rear view mirror over time. I think big data and analytics are going to provide new tools to let us see how we're doing in these areas, and perhaps some of you will see this as a great entrepreneurial opportunity. But for now, it's kind of tough over here, and yet soft has nothing to do with it being easier. It's actually harder to spend your time over here and to think about these things. Now, the hard versus soft debate is not a new one inside of organizations. You go back to the days of Frederick Taylor and scientific management in the late 19th century, and then the first great application of it, of Taylorism in Henry Ford's assembly lines. You know, people have been trying to figure out how to get better and faster all the time in business, at least for the last 130, 140 years. The battle is that on any given day, where do you put your capital and where do you put your attention? And the danger is that there's a built-in bias to put it overwhelmingly on the hard side. If you're a startup and you go see Mark Andreessen at Andreessen Horowitz, and you throw that great Peter Drucker line at him, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, you're going to be out of his office in 30 seconds. He's going to want to know how you're going to execute your business plan if you're going to get his money. Conversely, at the other end of the size spectrum, if you're a publicly traded CEO and you've missed your numbers and now you're on an analyst call with Wall Street and you say, you know, we put a lot of effort into the last quarter into our cultural values and that's why we've missed our numbers, you're not going to last long either. All the biases are on the hard edge. So why are the soft edges important? Because this is where you get the transformational gains. If you get the marginal gains on the hard edge side of execution, you get the transformational gains here. I just want to mention 3 quickly here, and in my book I measure 5. But trust, I call the force multiplier of all things good. It's the key to getting your employees, your customers, your whole supply chain really committed for your effort. I wrote about this fellow named Roberto Espinoza, who's an insurance salesman for Northwestern Mutual, up Highway 94 a bit in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I don't know about you, but selling insurance, I think, would be one of the hardest white-collar jobs there is, because you've got to make something on the order of 10 or 12 calls a day. You're facing rejection all the time. The marketplace is validating that you're a worm in the hierarchy of white-collar jobs. Why did you interrupt my dinner? You know, I can't talk to you now. I'm not interested in your darn product. Roberto was struggling, as many beginning insurance salesmen do. He didn't really believe in the value and the purpose of his career. He had a handful of clients. One of them had a life insurance policy. He was killed in a car accident. Roberto went to the funeral. Roberto was so discouraged about his job, by the way, that he cleaned out his desk 3 times over the course of 3 years. He said he became 5 times more productive in 5 seconds when the following happened. The 8-year-old girl of the deceased man got up and she said 2 things. She said, number 1, I miss my dad, and number 2, I know we'll be okay. Why did she say, I know we'll be okay? Because her mother said they'd be able to stay in the same house and she'd be able to go to the same school district. Why was that possible? Because her father had bought life insurance. Roberto went home, and it was like, do you ever see that original animated version of The Grinch Stole Christmas? And then the Grinch's heart grew 3 times that day? That's what happened with Roberto. He said it grew 5 times that day, that he now had a purpose in his career. Every time he thought he was facing rejection on a phone call, he saw a little girl on the end of that call, and it changed everything about his business. The next slide. I'm stuck on this slide. Can we advance the slide? There we go. Teams. I've got a book coming out on teams in July. It's called Team Genius. It posits that all the great work in the world gets done by 12 or 2 to 12 people informally, no matter what the org chart says. How do you create an organization that does that? You do it by staying lean. You do it by with cognitive diversity. And I wrote about in the book Howard Schultz and Howard Behar, who formed this great 2-person team, because Howard Schultz, the better known of the 2 Howards, very analytical, very driven. Howard Behar has an empathetic IQ that's off the charts. And without those two diverse thinking styles, you see, Starbucks would not have been able to create the culture that they did. Book is coming out in July. Forget org charts, as I said. And the last one I want to talk about is what Steve Jobs called taste. Now, isn't this an interesting word that the late great Steve Jobs used taste to describe Apple products? I think you know what he meant when you look at an iPhone or an iPad or a MacBook Pro or something like that. Beautiful products and they work well. With any physical object, whether it's the coin we were given, you know what is meant by taste. What does it mean for a business-to-business product, and what does it mean for a service? And when you parse everything away, what Steve Jobs is really talking about is that in a crowded world, you have to create products and services that appeal simultaneously to people's minds and their hearts. In other words, taste, what you're doing when you create taste in your product service is that you're fulfilling the customer's own best vision of themselves. You're taking them up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And there are more. I mentioned 3 of the soft edge attributes. In the book, there are 5. You were given a copy of the book. I'd be happy to sign it during a break. And thank you very much, Peter and Rob.